All right, well, why don't we just get started? And I think we're going to have a few more people join us during the class. All right, and let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Jackson. I'm a tutor here at Ringle. I've been a tutor for about 2 years, and I'm also working as a writer and editor and freelance. And I live in New York. And before that, I actually worked for a research firm, Third Bridge, which provides services to hedge funds, consulting firms, private equity firms. So I was there for about a year before I started freelancing. And I went to University of Chicago, where I studied philosophy. All right, so um, let's jump into what we're going to get up to today. So in this class, we're going to be kind of focusing on the fourth Ringle textbook about the coronavirus, the work from home textbook. So the first part of this lesson, we're going to kind of summarize this topic. I'm going to kind of go over some of the material from the textbook and also introduce some of my own thoughts and feelings about that material and some new material as well, because I think the textbook was written maybe in March or early April, and so much has happened since then. It's, March and April are like ages ago in Corona time. I feel like things have been moving really quickly. So we're going to discuss that in more detail than the textbook goes into. So that's going to be kind of the first part of the class. Then we're going to kind of go over each of the questions that the textbook has, and I'll give you good answers, bad answers. I think this time we're going to focus mostly on good answers. And I'll go over what makes them good and hopefully introduce you guys to some new phrases, new big business English terms that you guys can use in your everyday conversation, and also maybe stimulate some thinking about this topic. All right. And again, for people that just came in, feel free to ask questions throughout the session. Just ask them in the chat, please. And hopefully I can get to them. And we will have 2 Q&As, as I said, one after we summarize the topic and one at the end. So if you feel like your question can wait for that, that's fine. But again, feel free to also ask during the class. I encourage you to ask questions. All right, so let's get started. So let's begin very broadly. As I'm sure everybody remembers, and anybody that's been following some of my previous coronavirus classes knows, I like to start with kind of a big picture. So let's just remember kind of where this all started. So in December 2019, the first coronavirus patients appeared in Wuhan. Progressively over the next few months, they spread to virtually every country in the world. I think some countries claim to not have coronavirus cases, such as North Korea, but I think we all kind of know that the coronavirus is everywhere. And, even though the virus started to appear in December, and even though the alarm bells were ringing in January, when we learned that it could be transmitted from humans to humans, I think a lot of scientists were starting to ring the alarm bells about this virus in January. Most countries did not implement a lot of action until late February and March, and really March, I think, is kind of when that happened. South Korea was maybe a notable exception to that. I know South Korea had its big kind of spike in coronavirus cases happen in mid-February with the cult in Daegu. So I think South Korea was very early and aggressive in fighting the virus. And as you guys know, it's been one of the most successful countries in the world at doing that, probably the most successful country. So that's amazing. But by April 1st, 2020, most countries around the world, at least in the developed world, at least in the first world, were in some stage of lockdown or quarantine. Now, the particulars of the lockdown or quarantine varied country to country. But basically, if I had, I think, the situation was different in Italy, from the US, from Britain, from Norway, or even Sweden. But I think generally, in almost all these countries, with one or two exceptions, in the West, almost all non-essential workers were working from home. And what do I mean by non-essential? Basically workers that weren't involved in providing the most basic and necessary goods and services. So, I mean, police officers, grocery store workers, healthcare professionals. Those people continued to go to the office. Um, One other kinds of people, other people did too. Like one of my Ringle students works at a pharmaceutical company. She's a researcher, and work did not stop there because they were hoping to develop a coronavirus cure. So she's been going to the office. I think she's probably one of the few office workers. She actually lives in New York. She's South Korean, but she's based in New York. She's been one of the few people going to the office. Um, but for the most part, non-essential workers were working at home. So almost everybody I knew, for instance, my friends who were working at startups, consulting firms, in tech, and in all kinds of industries, fashion, whatever, almost all of them were working from home. And many others who maybe didn't have office jobs, maybe they just graduated college and they were working at a restaurant or a bar, they lost their jobs. So this was kind of all a consequence of the lockdown. Yeah, so I think basically by April 1st, most white collar workers were not at the office in the US and Europe. I know in South Korea, the situation was somewhat different, and we're going to be going over that in a little bit more detail and comparing it to what was going on in the States. One of the reasons is that South Korea never had to implement a full lockdown. It still hasn't. So many companies, some companies in South Korea did implement a work from home order, but it seems like maybe most companies, or especially the big companies, the big conglomerates like Samsung, LG, they still had workers coming to the office at least part of the time. I'm sure maybe some people in this class maybe work for some of the big conglomerates. And as you guys know, I'm sure many of you were probably on maybe what we call shift schedules, where you would go to the office sometimes and work from home sometimes. So I think, the situation was definitely a little bit different in South Korea from the US. But all right, so that was kind of the situation. And, I think what's going on now? You guys might have heard in the media, and maybe if you've been in some of my previous classes from last week, you probably heard that the US is starting to think about reopening. In fact, I think most states in the US have started to reopen a little bit to some extent, and many countries in Western Europe have also begun reopening. I think most places are kind of in this weird in-between stage where they're kind of open but kind of closed. And in the US, though, I will say that some areas remain largely closed. New York City, for instance, is mostly closed, and there seems to be the understanding that New York City will be the last place to reopen. It is it's probably the hardest hit place in the US from the virus, so that's not surprising. But what's going on with offices? So, I think the question sort of is, even if it's legal, even if offices in the US are allowed to reopen, are they necessarily going to want to? So that's kind of the big question at the moment. And there's been a lot of news stories in the media and a lot of discussion about this. So let's kind of go over the reasons for why maybe companies in the US are thinking about keeping their offices closed. So the biggest reason is that the virus is still out there. We still have 25,000 new cases in the US every day. We did not beat the virus with the lockdown. I think that's very clear. We did manage to slow the spread, but we did not manage to beat the virus. I think, and this is a big difference maybe between the US and South Korea. I know South Korea has been I know it had a spike in new cases recently, but in general, South Korea has kept its totals down in the double digits, maybe 100 new cases a day, maybe 50 cases, even as low as 10 new cases. The US is way up in the four figures or even five figures, 20,000 cases a day, 25,000 cases a day. So we haven't beat the virus yet here. So, I think offices that's one factor. And offices are what I would call incubators for virus transmission. An incubator is something that promotes an activity or is a host to something. So you could say offices are incubators for virus transmission. That would be a good way to say that. And lastly, I think telecommuting has kind of proved to be somewhat efficient. I think this has been kind of what I would call a large scale experiment almost, right? Like companies basically had to do this, and many of them sort of found that it worked, interestingly enough. So I think that I don't know if I think a lot of I don't think I think it is I think they've sort of found that telecommuting has been working much better than they expected. I have some friends who've told me that their company CEOs were very surprised by this, that efficiency stayed the same. So, um, so I think, all of these things have meant that companies in the US are not necessarily going to just reopen just because they can. Sorry, offices going to reopen just because they can. And there's been talk of extending the work from home orders until January 2020, which is over 6 months away. So that's kind of interesting. Some sectors are moving faster than others. Probably, I think predictably, maybe the sector that seems to be moving fastest is the tech industry in Silicon Valley. That's, I think, for most of us, that's probably not much of a surprise. I think we can describe Silicon Valley as kind of the vanguard, right? The vanguard of a lot of trends that are changing working culture and stuff like that. A vanguard is a group that's ahead, like it is leading the trend. So you could say Silicon Valley is a kind of vanguard. For instance, Twitter recently announced that many of its employees could potentially work from home permanently. But it also goes beyond the tech sector. Big banks have also suggested that not all of their employees have to return to their New York offices, including Barclays and JP Morgan. So I think this shift towards telecommuting has been a little bit larger than a lot of experts predicted. And I would just emphasize, though, that we don't really know the fundamental long-term impact on office culture yet. But a lot of experts do predict that something is going to change, that a lot of habits will change. All right, so one other thing I want to emphasize here, and I'm going to try to bring it out more in the questions when we go over the questions, is that this change towards telecommuting, towards working from home, and those two terms are largely synonymous. Working from home and telecommuting they kind of mean the same thing. Well, and at least in this lesson, they're going to mean the same thing. So I think working from home is not going to just change office workers' lives. I think it's going to change much more than that. It could potentially affect cities, neighborhoods, urban planning. Whole neighborhoods and urban ways of life have kind of sprung up around office culture, right? So, like, think of the restaurant that is located next to your office tower, or think of, if you're in New York, that there's all kinds of restaurants or even vendor carts that hang out on specific corners to draw office workers for lunch. So there's this whole kind of ecosystem that has grown up around them. And obviously, lots of real estate companies have built these huge towers. We've been in the midst of a big skyscraper boom for the past few years. And they had planned on having a lot of this space be commercial space. And if it's not going to be commercial space, then there's all kinds of questions about what's going to happen to it. So these changes, I think it's a mistake to just think of this as just being about like, am I going to be working at the office or working at home? And I think you want to think about the larger scale society changes that are at work here, or the larger scale changes that could potentially happen. So all right, so good. So let's keep moving here. So let's talk a little bit about the tools of telecommuting. So I think what's clear is that telecommuting, working from home in the way that we do now, would have been impossible 20 years ago. I don't know if anybody in this class was working 20 years ago. I'm sure maybe some people were, or listening to this lecture. But think back. I mean, if without, I think without internet technologies, it would have been kind of impossible for most of us to do our job from home, right? Um, but the internet has kind of opened up all kinds of new possibilities. Some people, I think, I think people that I saw an interview with one CEO who sort of said that, we could have, really in the last 5 or 6 years, it's become possible to move so many jobs out of offices, and that we kind of stayed in offices out of just a sense of inertia. This is what we always did. This is what we're always going to do. But I think this pandemic has shown us that not necessarily. Things could be done another way. So yeah, so I think, this has all become possible recently because of internet-based technologies. Let's go over some of the tools that make this possible. You guys are obviously pretty familiar with these, so I'm gonna try to, move through this slide pretty quickly, but video conferencing platforms like the one we're on right now, right? I mean, Zoom, Skype, Google Meet, Google Hangout, all of those services allow for a kind of, an unprecedented collaboration. And Zoom has become kind of, has really taken off during the pandemic. I think people that have been doing the Ringle lessons have probably seen how, we might have seen our Zoom topic on Ringle. And they'll know that, Zoom stock price has been zooming up. And it's kind of become what I would call a household name in the US. And what's a household name? That means a word that everybody uses, and the average citizen knows what it is. And during the pandemic, Zoom has kind of become a household name because so many millions and millions of people are using it. And it's even being used as a verb, which is always a sign that something has kind of entered the culture, right? So we're sort of using it, saying to Zoom, in the same way that we often say like to Uber or something like that. Are we going to Uber to the movie? Do you want to Zoom later? I think, when a company name enters our language like that, that's always a sign that it's kind of becoming a fundamental part of our daily lives. So, all right, so Zoom and other video conferencing platforms are crucial. I think, what they really, one of Zoom's maybe big innovation is that it's really good at group meetings, like the one we're having right now. There are some companies that have shied away a little bit from Zoom. Some of you might have been familiar with this. As far as I understand it, it's basically kind of easy to guess Zoom ID numbers. So it's pretty easy for people to hack into meetings. So if you're, I think if you're a top secret company who's worried about corporate secrets being stolen or intellectual property theft or just corporate surveillance, then Zoom might not be the best tool for you. But typically they're using some other kind of video conferencing platform. All right, so the other things, Google Shared Documents. This presentation was made using Google Shared Documents. So that's, Google Docs, Google Slides, stuff like that. This stuff kind of, I think is crucial because it allows kind of real-time collaboration. We can, in the same way that we might work on a presentation together, say you and me are at the office and I'm building a presentation, and maybe you're looking over my shoulder. You're kind of saying, Jack, put that graphic there or write that. Well, we can now do that because we can, each have our computers and both be on the presentation at the same time. So that's been important. Slack has also been important because it allows people to kind of search and look at past work documents. And I think maybe even more importantly, Slack has, it's kind of like the in-house social media for a company, right? Slack is a way for corporations to maintain their culture even when people are separate. So I think Slack has been, I think that's the big important thing about Slack, is that Slack allows companies to retain a version of their corporate culture even when people are not in the office. All right, so I think the good news is that a lot of these technologies can replace things that we do in the office. But, I think there are some questions about whether they can really fully replace them. I think, um, I've heard from a lot of Ringle students, and I've heard from corporate executives in the media that they're skeptical of this as a long-term solution. They admit that, it's possible to run a business via telecommuting, but is it necessarily desirable? And does it maybe lead to burnout? Does it, will it gradually destroy company culture, over time? It's kind of unclear. Um, I think people have also complained about feeling there's this idea of Zoom fatigue, right? That you're kind of tired of I've heard from people that they're tired of spending all their time on Zoom. They miss real human to human interaction in the real world. So I think the question is a little bit unanswered. And I think that's going to be one of the key themes of this presentation, is that we don't, we're kind of undergoing this experiment right now out of necessity, something that we've kind of been forced into. And we don't really know how things are going to end up, or how they're going to shake out in the end. It seems like there's maybe a couple ways things could go. So I think, I would be wary of anybody that says they know exactly what's going to happen in the future. In this presentation, I'm going to try to steer you guys to maybe a couple different things that could happen. All right, so let's keep moving. I wanted to briefly go over some of the differences between the US and South Korea on this before we jump into the questions. So there's kind of, I think some people have argued that American companies were, and maybe European companies too, were better prepared to do this kind of work from home arrangement, just based on how their corporations were structured. So, in the US, I think there's already a high degree of telecommunication. A lot of companies operate major offices have offices across the different major cities. This was, definitely true for like consulting firms and stuff like that. There's an office in New York, there's an office in Chicago, there's an office in San Francisco, stuff like that. So they've already have kind of the infrastructure for this maybe already in place. And additionally, Silicon Valley was famous for kind of introducing what I would call horizontal decision-making structures. So decision-making apparatuses. So what do I mean by that? Well, vertical is like this, top down. Horizontal means more like, cross. And a lot of software engineering departments in Silicon Valley have become very horizontal. And it means that you don't have to have so much centralized decision-making. And it means that people can kind of make decisions on their own and with their close teammates. And it means it means that people can kind of operate more on their own. They don't need to be constantly following orders from their boss. They don't necessarily need to be in constant contact with their boss. And this is, I think this is another thing. I think it's easier to go to work from home if you have a horizontal decision-making structure. That's probably why maybe things have been a little more difficult for South Korea. So as you guys, I'm sure because I'm sure many of you guys work for these companies, most workers for large companies work from the company's headquarters in Seoul. And they are not as used to teleconferencing as their American counterparts. And I think the other thing is that decision-making tends to be a lot more vertical. And I've heard from a lot of Ringle students that they feel that this kind of vertical decision-making structure really relies on face-to-face communication. And, I think and they've said that that's a big part of their company culture, is kind of face-to-face communication. And I think, that kind of working culture is much more difficult to manage from home than at an office. So I think for these reasons, and I would also add that I think maybe another reason would be that Korea had an excellent testing and contact tracing regime. And what I mean by that is that Korea was able to track the coronavirus really well. and keep an eye and basically track it in close to real time, right? So the government knew where coronavirus cases were, and they didn't we did you guys didn't have the same kind of uncontrolled spread that we had in the US. And that kind of excellent testing and contact tracing regime, combined with the reasons I mentioned earlier, I think have allowed Korean offices to remain open, at least partially. So many of the Ringle students I've talked to are on what we've kind of called a shift schedule, um, which is where maybe you work at the office for a week, and there are social distancing protocols in place at the office, but then you go home for a week. And this is designed to kind of bring down the population density in offices and stop the spread, or at least slow the spread. So I think, and I think, it seems like this has been working for Korea. I know you guys probably know better than I do, but I feel like Korea has kept its cases low. I don't know if there's been a lot of office to office spread or a lot of spread inside the offices, but I think this strategy has kind of worked. So that's kind of interesting as well. All right, so good. So one of the other big questions here that has been lurking in the background is, and what's more efficient, working from the office or working from home? Um, and my answer to this, as far as I can tell, is that I'm going to use the phrase, the jury is out. And what that means is that we don't know yet. As I said, the same that we don't know about what's going to happen with the pandemic, we don't really know yet if working from home is more or less efficient than working at the office. There's been some early research that has come out. I know a Stanford professor, I believe, talked to some Chinese workers that were working from home, or did some kind of study with a group of Chinese workers early in the pandemic, and seemed to find that they were actually working much more efficiently than they had previously. So that's positive evidence for working from home. But again, that's maybe one small study. I think we all know that more research is kind of needed in this area. My own anecdotal evidence from speaking to lots of Ringle students is that it's kind of a mixed bag. I think some Ringle students have told me that they find it much easier to work from home and that they are more efficient. Others feel like maybe they're less efficient because there's more distractions at home. They feel like maybe they concentrate less hard, and some of them find it more difficult to do their jobs because they have to schedule all these Zoom meetings. So again, I think the jury is out on all of this. And a lot of corporate executives have said, I talked earlier about how Twitter is letting people work from home. I talked about how Barclays and JP Morgan have suggested that many workers can work from home. But other corporate executives in the States have suggested that this is not going to be the new normal, that this is kind of just a temporary solution. There was a city executive, I forget which team he managed, but and the media reported that a city executive who ran one of the big city divisions said that his team wants to get back to the office. They miss the social interaction of the office. They feel like they are isolated at home. They feel like they feel like they work better and more efficiently at the office. So again, I think the jury is still out on all of this. And I just want to mention again that there's a lot at stake here. I think whatever happens in the future, if telecommuting and working from home really do take off, if they do become a major part of our working culture, it's going to alter cities a lot. I think I think in America, most big cities like New York, San Francisco, LA, whatever, other cities too, but big booming cities have enjoyed a renaissance for about 30 years, where lots of young professionals, creatives, smart people have come to cities because that's where the jobs have been, the jobs in finance, in technology, in the media, fashion. So, but if workers don't have to work at in these offices in the city, maybe people will go back. Maybe people will depart from the city. Maybe this trend will be reversed, or at least slowed down or paused. Um, Especially if the coronavirus drags on. I think we're all hoping that a vaccine is available next year, early next year. But what if it's not? And what if the coronavirus is here for a year, 2 years? Um, People might begin to seriously evaluate whether they want to be in cities. I mean, especially older people, right? Especially maybe older office workers in their 40s, 50s. Maybe they'll say, you know what, it's better to be in the suburbs where it's much easier to socially distance. Um, so what happens if this? So what's going to happen if this change occurs? Well, as I said, I think there's going to be the immediate impact to neighborhoods that will be wrecked. I think neighborhoods that have kind of been built up around um, office spaces. I think all kinds of businesses, bars, restaurants, other things have kind of grown up to serve these office towers. Those They could go out of business. Probably maybe more damaging would be the lost tax revenue to the city. If businesses close and offices leave, tax revenue will go down, and then the city will be in trouble. It'll have to cut its public services or raise taxes. This could decrease the quality of life in the city. This is kind of what happened in New York in the 1950s, 60s, really, the 1960s and 1970s. A lot of companies left New York in the 60s and 70s and moved to the suburbs, and the city lost tax revenue, and services declined. And then office workers themselves went to the suburbs. So, the city kind of lost it lost its tax base, and and basically was plunged into about a decade of poverty. And this almost went bankrupt in the mid 70s. So good. All right. So, I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen in the future, but some people have suggested that this new scenario reminds them of that. All right, so let's stop there for the moment, and I want to see if anybody has any questions for me. So I'm going to have a drink of water and some tea, and if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box. I'll wait maybe a minute or two. All right. Well, I'll give it another few seconds. If you want to ask a question, go for it now, because I'm about to move on to the question and answers. But all right. Well, feel free if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat during the class or at the end. There'll be some time too. All right. So let's look at the questions. Now, my goal here is to maybe give everybody a few perspectives on these questions, and I created a few different kinds of answers. Some of these answers are based on conversations I've had with Ringle students. Some are based on conversations I've had with my friends. Some of them are sort of what I think. It's kind of a mix. And I tried to represent a bunch of different viewpoints to try to give you guys some thoughts, and introduce some new ideas, and give you guys a few guides to maybe how one could go about answering this question or talking about an answer. All right, so the first question is stay home, work home widely implemented in your country? Tell your tutor about the state of the stay home, work home order in your city. So this is the first answer. I live in the US, where stay home, work from home has been widely implemented. The details vary state by state. In New York City, where I am right now, offices remained closed and everybody except essential workers is working from home. People can go out for exercise and you'll see them walking around the city. All of this has actually made my own neighborhood very crowded because no one is going to the office. But if you take a walk to business districts, you'll see how empty they are. So This is kind of a report. This is based on my own experiences in New York. I'm not in New York right now. I'm actually staying with my family in Massachusetts, but I live in the city normally. And this was my experience during the first week or two of the lockdown back in March. And I've updated it a little bit with some things I've heard from my friends who remain in the city. I think this is a good answer. I think it does the job. It's not a great answer. It doesn't really go into too much about when the order will be lifted, and it doesn't provide too many details. But I think it's kind of it does the job, and and I like how this. And I think this is a very true observation. What's kind of interesting is that because no one's going to the office, residential neighborhoods are very crowded, whereas business districts are kind of ghost towns. Um, on the first slide of this presentation, on the right, I had a picture of Times Square that was taken in the last few weeks, and it's like an empty ghost town, which is kind of for anybody that's been to Times Square during its normal times, it's always packed with people. So all right, so the next answer. I live in Seoul, South Korea, where social distancing protocols are being observed, but there is no lockdown. My office has actually remained open through the pandemic. However, we now work on a shift schedule. Half of us goes to work for 1 week, then the next week the other half goes to work. We expect to continue like this into June. I see people out and about in my neighborhood, but everyone wears masks. So out and about means just when you see people strolling around, out and about. All right, so I like this answer too. I think this answer is kind of the South Korean version of the first answer. If it just kind of reports the facts on the ground, and I like how I think it's the description of the shift schedule is pretty good, and yeah, and I like how I think if this answer wanted to be a little bit stronger, maybe it could talk a little bit more about what it's like to work a shift schedule, or maybe go into a little bit more detail about what the company's plans are in the future. And all right. So the next one is this is from This is from a friend of mine, actually, or based on something a conversation I had with a friend of mine who lives in Texas. So this answer goes: I live in the U.S., but the state I live in, Texas, has begun to lift its lockdown, and restaurants and other businesses are beginning to reopen. It's great to see people get back to work, but I'm also worried about a new wave of coronavirus cases, so I've been mostly staying in. Plus, I work for a major tech company, and they've told us that they're not planning to reopen the office until 2021. All right, so I like this answer for a bunch of reasons, because I think it captures something about how a lot of people are feeling, right? At least in the US, I think. I think it's true. Businesses are reopening, things are restarting, but people don't necessarily feel safe because the virus is still here. I think you could still get it. And so there's this weird situation where businesses are open and some people are out, but other people are nervous about going out. And also, I think this answer also gets at an interesting dichotomy. And what I mean by that is that most office workers aren't really going to be heading back to work for a while, whereas people who are maybe more blue collar workers or people who work in the service industry, like restaurants, they're going to be the first people to go back. They're kind of on the front lines of all of this. So I feel like there's this kind of weird dichotomy where office workers are kind of being protected, but service workers maybe aren't. So I think a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about that. At the same time, I think this answer is right? I think it is good to see people get back to work, and I think a lot of us feel that way, right? Because the economy has been so terrible. It's great that people need to go back to work to put food on the table and to try to reverse some of this bad economic damage. So there's a lot of good things about this answer and a lot of interesting issues that are raised by it. All right, good. So let's maybe look at the next question. So please describe the tools that enable you to work from home. Are you used to working with these tools? All right, so the first answer. I work in sales, and the pandemic has made my job very difficult because I usually meet my customers in person. However, beginning in April, I've begun to make my pitches over Zoom. I can't say I loved Zoom in the beginning because I rely on reading my customers' body language in order to adjust my pitch and establish a connection. However, I've begun to slowly adjust to the platform and became much more comfortable using it. I definitely love how convenient it is. I anticipate that I will try to incorporate video conferencing into my work even after the pandemic is over. So, so good. So I like this. I like this answer a lot, and I really love the part about. I think this answer narrates something that we've all maybe been experiencing, where um, video conferencing can be very awkward in the beginning. It's tough to, I think we're used to reading people's body language, and what that means. When you say I'm reading someone's body language, it means you're kind of um, looking at their gestures and facial expressions and how they're sitting and kind of interpreting their mood. And I think, I think that's one of the main things that is missing in video conferencing because we can kind of see someone's face, but we can't, it's kind of tough to get a sense of what they're, there's all kinds of data that's missing. Like, how are they sitting? And it's, I don't know, there's a lot that's missing on Zoom. So I like that a lot. I like how this answer brings that out. But the other thing I think that the answer is also bringing out is that I think over time you can develop a sense for Zoom or a sense for video conferencing. You can learn to have better conversations over it. And this is something that I've definitely experienced. I've been a Ringle tutor for a really long time. I have to say, my first time, uh, the first time I really used Zoom was to do my mock session with Ringle, where I was basically leading a session with a staff member, and they were trying to determine if I was going to be a good fit or not for Ringle. And I remember I found it so awkward. And I was sure when it was over that I hadn't passed the interview, but thankfully I did. Thankfully I did. And maybe my performance wasn't as bad as I thought, but I definitely felt this kind of awkwardness with Zoom. And then I remember that the awkwardness was still there during my first lessons on Ringle. But as time went on, it kind of disappeared. And these days, I think, maybe because I'm on Zoom every day, I feel very comfortable on it. And I think I still miss I still miss face to face in, meeting someone in a room. But I've learned to maybe compensate with that. And I've learned how to read people over Zoom. It's not the same as being in the same room as someone, but it's something. And I think this answer is kind of getting at that. And, maybe there's the possibility that losing the ability to read someone's body language, maybe is made up for with the gain in convenience. I don't know. We don't know. It's one of the unknown factors that I was talking about. And I think a lot of, I was talking with someone who's a CEO of a company in Korea, and he was telling me that he's been doing all of his interviews for new hires over Zoom for the past 2 months. And he told me that he's likes it. He thinks that he might continue doing that forever, but he's also not sure if he's going to maybe wait and see, because he says that, it's super convenient. That's why he likes it. But he wants to make sure that he's making good decisions over Zoom and hiring the right people. So I think that a lot of people have that attitude. They're going to kind of wait and see if it works out. All right. So next answer. I work in consulting. So I spend a large portion of my day either on video calls. That should read, I work in consulting, so I spend a large portion of my day on video calls, not either on video calls. Because of security issues, we use another video conferencing platform besides Zoom. I also spend a lot of time on Google Docs or Slides, writing reports and putting together slide decks. A slide deck is just another name for a PowerPoint presentation, by the way. Honestly, working from home doesn't feel that different from working at the office or on site at a client's office. though sometimes it's very difficult to juggle all the Zoom calls I have to schedule. Because of this, I feel like my work takes even longer than before. So I feel like this person is kind of expressing a low-key hostile attitude towards working from home. I think, I think the first answer was somewhat optimistic and was about overcoming a challenge. Um, um, and the second answer is kind of negative. I think, it's it's much more focused on the drawbacks, and maybe that's the weakness of the answer. I think if this person could maybe talk maybe about um, talk a little bit more about what's been gained by using these tools, or um, more about but all right, I mean, I guess maybe that's not so important, but yeah, I think actually that could be a good thing to add. And yeah, I do like, I think this person does indicate their familiarity with the tools, which is what this question's kind of asking. So that's a good point as well. Um, all right, good. And I think these two answers do reflect the kind of maybe 2 points of views that I'm seeing a lot on Ringle. People that people that are adjusting to Zoom and enjoying working from home, and other people who are anxious to get back to the office. All right, good. So let's go into question 3. So this question says, please describe the advantages and disadvantages to telecommuting. All right, so I included a few different points of view here. So let's start with the first view, which is kind of maybe the super positive view. Telecommuting is the best. I'm our company's only designer, and I largely work alone at the office anyways. Instead of a 45-minute commute during which I have to stand, I simply hop out of bed, take a shower, and walk into my living room. Then voila, I'm at my desk. Also, I can play classical music on my sound system, which helps me concentrate. When the day is over, I can simply shut my laptop and head into the kitchen to get started on dinner. The only disadvantage is that I cannot have lunch with my coworkers, whose company I enjoy, and sometimes I don't leave the house all day. All right. So I like this answer a lot. I think it's one of the better answers that I've seen. Just in case people don't know, voila means that you're there. Like you say, like, voila, here's the present, or something's there, or voila, we're here. So that's what that is. It's French actually. It comes from French, but sometimes we use it in English. All right, but back to this answer. I like this answer. I think it obviously spends a lot more time on the advantages than the disadvantages, but I do think it does give the disadvantages a fair hearing and does list a few disadvantages. And I think this is something that I've been seeing a lot from students, where even people that love telecommuting do miss a little bit the social connection. So that's maybe a balancing act. And I think, and this person is on the other hand, though, this person is a great candidate for telecommuting, right? Like, they work alone at their office. They don't really, they're the only designer. They don't really need to be there. They're kind of they're there because there's this idea that everybody in the company should come to work in the same place every day. It's like what I was talking about earlier, this inertia that we have, this old idea. So I think, it's kind of interesting. This answer, it brings up a bunch of interesting points. All right, so let's move into 2 new opinions, and both of these are somewhat negative. So let's begin with the first one. As someone who owns a restaurant in a popular business district, I'm very worried about the rise of telecommuting. I understand that it might save companies lots of money, but if companies leave the nearby office towers, then I will not have the foot traffic to sustain my business. And foot traffic means people walking by, so customers walking by. All right, so this answer, I think, brings up, it's short but sweet, and it does bring up a very valid concern, right? That, like I was talking about earlier, if large amounts of people do actually telecommute, then there are going to be lots of businesses that have to close or adjust. So I think that is a very valid issue. On the other hand, I think this question, it is a little one-sided, right? It doesn't really, it talks a little, I guess it does talk a little bit about some of the advantages, like companies saving money, but it's kind of focused on its own problems, right? And I totally understand that. I think, it's a lot of us in this crisis, a lot of us have to focus on our own problems. But I think this answer could be a little stronger if it was able to take a longer term view, maybe. So as this person, as everybody in business knows, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And, you know, maybe his restaurant will have to close, but maybe other opportunities will open up elsewhere. You know, maybe there will be more demand for restaurants in residential communities, or more demand for takeout, or something like that. So I think if this answer included that, then it would be a stronger answer. All right, last. As a teacher, I find teaching classes over Zoom means that my own instruction declines in quality. I also have to spend more time working than before. So it's worse for both teachers and students. The only advantage is that sometimes my working hours are more flexible. So similarly to the other answer, I think this one is very focused on its own problems, right? This person is obviously having trouble adjusting to teaching in an online classroom. And I sympathize with them. I think especially, my own feeling as someone who's someone who teaches on Ringle and teaches a lot, is that Zoom and online classes work really well one-on-one, with one-on-one instruction, or with a group of people that are dedicated students. And I think like the kind of people that are on Ringle, who are, you guys for the most part are adults who are, on your own time, and you're dedicated to learning English because you want to advance your career, or you want to, or you just, want to be better at it. So you're motivated students, and you're a teacher's dream, really, people that are, but, I think a lot of people that teach at a lower level, like middle school and high school, they have trouble motivating their students. And I feel like it's so much more difficult to motivate students when you're teaching an online class, and your connection to them is so much thinner. And I think, and also a lot of middle school and high school classes rely on kind of group work, collaborative work, things that can only kind of happen in the classroom. So I think this answer does bring up a lot of valid points. I think maybe if this answer was going to be a little bit stronger, maybe it could talk a little bit more about how, I think this person who wrote this seems like they have a little bit of a closed-minded attitude. Like maybe they need to consider that teaching online is different from teaching in a classroom. I think this person seems to assume that they can take their methods from the classroom and just transfer them online, when in fact they might have to develop new methods. Obviously, that's going to take time and resources. So it's not super easy, but maybe that is what is required. So maybe if this answer touched on that dimension a little bit more, then it would be a stronger answer. All right, so let's go to the next. So what do you think about the argument that major companies in Asia are less effective at teleworking than those in Silicon Valley? So let's go through two answers. The first, and this is, I've heard this from a lot of students, version of this answer, and this is, so all right, so I think that Korean and other Asian companies are having a tough time dealing with this sudden switch to telecommuting because they lack the infrastructure that American companies, especially those in Silicon Valley, already had in place. Additionally, Asian companies tend to rely on vertical decision-making, which can be difficult to maintain when everyone is working from home. I mentioned vertical decision-making earlier. But just a refresher, it's a top-down. It's like, when a boss, when decisions happen at the top and then they kind of filter down. Anyways, I think this creates the impression that Asian companies are quote unquote less efficient at teleworking than those in Silicon Valley. All right, so I think this is a good answer, a very good answer. I would give it B+, A-, B+, A-. I think, I think it brings up two good reasons about not having the infrastructure and relying on vertical decision making. But I don't know. I think it lacks that special something, that sense of personal insight that would make a stronger answer. And and I think that maybe this next answer is something that I heard from one of my favorite students, and I think it's a really strong answer for a lot of reasons. I think it goes the extra mile, if you will. Um, and all right, so in some ways it's going to be similar to the first answer, but in some ways it's going to be a little different. So let's look at this. Most Asian companies were not ready for the sudden transition to teleworking. In Japan, for instance, many companies still relied on paper documents for their work processes. However, I am wary of this idea that Asian companies are less efficient at teleworking than American or European companies. I think it promotes unhealthy stereotypes. For example, that Asian countries are hierarchical and resistant to change. I think that, given time, Asian companies would be able to set up teleworking systems that rival those of American and European companies. So I like this answer because I think it brings up a really, I think it does bring up that dimension here, right? Like, when people make these kinds of generalizations about Asia and the West and Silicon Valley, is it maybe unhelpful? Is it maybe stereotyping or even a little racist? Well, possibly. And I think this answer is really getting at that dimension. And I think it's doing a lot of critical thinking about this. So I would give this answer an A. I think this is a really strong answer, probably one of the stronger ones that I've seen. So yeah, so I think I think this answer maybe goes the extra mile. It's critical of some of the assumptions of the question, and goes that extra mile with thinking. So that's why I really like it. All right, so let's move into the last question, and this is the kind of the million. This is the tough question, right? So when the pandemic is over, do you think schools, companies, and organizations should continue to practice telecommuting? Why do you think so? So let's note that should. It doesn't say will. In other words, it's not asking for a prediction necessarily. It's asking for a recommendation. Should they do it? Should they do it? All right. So I came up with a few different kinds of answers here. The first one, I think so. Telecommuting is one of the major trends of the 21st century. It will make our working culture more pleasant and provide environmental benefits. I also think that schools, especially universities, should integrate online learning into their curriculums. College has become so expensive, particularly in the US, and perhaps online classes will help reverse this trend. All right, so I like this answer. I think it's not necessarily my own point of view, but I do think it brings up a bunch of good points. One thing that we haven't talked about so much is that telecommuting is environmentally beneficial, right? Because generally, people are not driving to work or not taking public transportation. So greenhouse gas emissions should fall. And office spaces obviously will take up less emissions too. So that's a good point. And we haven't covered that so much in this class, but I think that's a great point to bring up. The other good point is that college is expensive. It's becoming prohibitively so. When college is as much as $60,000 or $70,000 a year, something's wrong. That's the price of some universities in the States. What I don't necessarily agree with is the solution. I don't know if online classes are necessarily the answer for colleges. So, all right. So I guess that's sort of my own opinion. Otherwise, I think this is a really strong answer. All right. The next one. Now, this person, I think, is a little more skeptical of telecommuting than the first person. So I like working from home, but I also miss my office. My job requires a lot of team collaboration, and it would be so much easier if we were all in one space together. I also miss the social aspects of going to the office, such as having lunch with my teammates or going for drinks after work. Also, my kids miss their school. Zoom classes are just not the same as in-person classes. I feel like they are missing out on crucial opportunities to build social and team working skills. Above all, this pandemic has made me realize how important it is to be a part of a community. All right, so I love this answer for a few reasons. I think, I like how it kind of unifies a few different threads into one thesis at the end, right? It kind of, this answer connects the the person's experience at their own office with the kind of their kids' experience at school. And I think it points to a kind of common denominator, right? That the one thing that we're kind of missing with teleworking is that sense of community, or at least a lot of people feel that way. So I think this answer does a great job of kind of tying those two threads together. And I think and I think it does kind of bring up one of the probably the I think it does I think that objection is a big one. I think and maybe the most important reason why we have to think hard about telecommuting is, are we letting our kids down? Are we, if they're not, it's important for kids to be socializing with other children, and it helps them grow as people and develop important skills. So I think that's a crucial issue to raise as well. All right, so last one, and this might be relevant to some people that are thinking about going to MBA. And this is based on an answer that I got from one of my students who's in an MBA program right now. They're a first year. So they're kind of nervous about MBA going online next year. So this person said, as an MBA student, I hope in-person classes resume in the fall. It just doesn't feel the same. I've been to a few Zoom networking events and I felt they were painfully awkward. I know a lot of people are promoting telecommuting because it's safer and saves organizations money, but I feel like we're losing something living our entire lives online. So, I think this person has a little bit of a different perspective, slightly different focus than the previous one we looked at, but I think they're thinking similar thoughts. I think, MBA is all about community, right? I mean, obviously the classes and the coursework are important, but so many people go to MBA to network and to meet and to have the kind of out-of-class bonding experiences that help them grow as leaders and help them develop crucial soft skills that will serve them well in the corporate world. So this person's sort of saying, I'm not getting that part of the education when we're online. So I think that, this is that I mean, looking back at my own college experience, that on-campus experience was just as important as the classes themselves. So, and that's all missing with online classes. So I think that's something we definitely need to think about as we talk about maybe moving classes online temporarily or even permanently. So yeah, I think I like this answer a lot for bringing that issue into the forefront. So all right, so good. So we're basically out of time. I'm gonna just basically try to summarize briefly what we went over in the class, and then if people have questions, I'd love to hear them. So so basically, we sort of went over the what's been happening with teleworking and telecommuting and working from home in the US and South Korea, how the coronavirus kind of set this all off, what tools people are using like Zoom and Google Suite, the Google tools like Google Slides and Google Docs, and also how the working from home trend could alter other areas of life, like the cities and urban life. So I think if there's one takeaway I want you guys to kind of take away from this presentation is that this is a big issue, that, I think, as I said, this could impact a lot of diverse areas of life. I think anybody that saw my presentation about the coronavirus and the economy knows that I kept emphasizing that everything is connected. Everything's connected. And this decision, whether to work online or work in an office, is connected to so many things as well. So, so I just want everybody to think about that. And I want us as a society to think long and hard about the long-term consequences of moving to telecommuting. The good things, the benefits that could happen, and the bad things as well. And I think, all right, so I think that's pretty much it from me. If anybody has questions, I'd love to hear them. All right, well, I hope everybody's weekend is going well. So it's 3 p.m. probably in Korea. So hopefully everybody's got a fun rest of your day planned, whether you've got work to catch up on or movies to watch later or TV. I know that after this is over, I'll be heading to bed, as you guys can probably imagine. uh, but um, but all right. Well, um, excellent. Here are some other packets that I would highly recommend that you check out. These, as you know, this series has been kind of based on these textbooks, and I'll be doing another session, the final session tomorrow at the same time. We're going to be looking at Bill Gates and Elon Musk's differing approaches to the pandemic. So if you're trying to learn as much as you can about the coronavirus and the situation in the US, that could be a great class to attend as well. And I think it'll be kind of interesting and fun because uh, Bill Gates and Elon have had totally opposite approaches in the pandemic. And Elon is kind of a wacky, interesting figure, um, and always entertaining. So I think it'll be an interesting class tomorrow. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to send them to webinar@ringleplus.com. And as always, thanks for joining. So yeah, hope everybody has a great rest of your weekend. And looking forward to hopefully seeing some of you tomorrow and in the future.